My name is Petra Calloway. I was 46 years old at the time, and I had spent over 2 decades working as a small business operations consultant, helping other people keep their companies alive while quietly watching my own unravel. I am not someone who asks for sympathy easily. I built things. I fixed things. I stayed up late and got up early and believed, for a very long time, that hard work was its own kind of protection. I was wrong about that, but I learned something better in its place. And my sister taught me, though not in the way she intended. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. The family barbecue was loud and easy the way summer gatherings usually are. Food on the table, children running across the lawn, conversations overlapping without anyone minding. I was standing near the drinks table talking to our cousin when my sister, Bet, walked over and inserted herself into the group the way she always did, with complete confidence and zero awareness of whether she was wanted. Someone must have mentioned my storefront, because Betty's face lit up with the particular delight of a person who has been waiting for an opening. She laughed, loud and deliberate, and said, "Oh, you mean her cute little midlife hobby?" The group went quiet. I felt my face go still. She kept going. She called it a learning experience with a smile that made the words mean something much uglier. I excused myself, walked to the bathroom, and stood over the sink with both hands on the cold porcelain. Through the thin wall, I heard her laughing again. She said, "She'll never recover from that." I looked at myself in the mirror and made a quiet decision. I would not defend myself, but I would not forget. That night I sat alone in my kitchen long after I should have been in bed. I went back through everything. The years, the sacrifices, the specific and grinding cost of building something from the ground up. I had sold my car in the second year to cover a supplier invoice. I had drained a savings account I had been building since my 30s. I had worked past midnight more times than I could count, answering emails and adjusting inventory numbers while the rest of the street was dark and quiet. The business hadn't failed because I was careless or naive or simply not good enough. It had failed because a key supplier collapsed without warning and took 3 months of paid orders with them. That was the truth of it. But what I felt sitting in that kitchen wasn't grief about the money. It was something sharper, the particular pain of being written off completely by someone who had never once asked what actually happened. Then I opened my laptop and found an email that reframed everything I thought I understood about how it had all gone wrong. The email was from a former business contact, a woman who had worked briefly inside the supply chain network connected to my collapsed supplier. She had sent it 2 weeks earlier and I had missed it in the chaos of closing down. She wrote carefully, but the meaning was clear. The supplier's financial trouble had been known inside certain corporate circles at least 4 months before the collapse became public. My sister, Bet, worked in a senior procurement role at a firm that operated in exactly that industry. She had the contacts. She had the access. She would have heard. I sat with that email for a long time. Then I went back through my memory of every conversation Bet and I had shared in those final months. Every family dinner, every phone call, every casual exchange. She had said nothing. Not a hint. Not a warning. The laughter at the barbecue hadn't come from ignorance of what happened to me. It had come from someone who had known, stayed silent, and found my collapse amusing anyway. I closed the laptop and cut contact the following morning. I took a consulting position 3 months later through a firm that didn't know my history and didn't ask about it. I applied under my maiden name, Petra Voss, which I had not used professionally in over a decade. The role was quiet. Internal process reviews, supplier risk assessments, operational gap analysis for mid-sized companies. It was humbling in the way that starting over always is. I was in rooms with people 10 years younger than me, earning less than I had earned at 32. Nobody knew what I had built or what I had lost, and I was grateful for that invisibility in a way I hadn't expected. I kept my head down. I did good work. I asked few questions and answered even fewer. I told myself this was temporary, a landing platform while I figured out the next thing. But within the first 6 weeks, I noticed something about the company's upper leadership that made me want to understand the place more carefully before I decided how long to stay. The all-hands meeting happened in the 8th week. The director of strategy stood at the front of the room and walked through a competitive landscape slide. Companies in our sector, their market positions, their known vulnerabilities. I was sitting near the back, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, when one of the logos on the slide made me stop writing. It was Betty's company. Her firm appeared in the slide as a mid-tier competitor with strong brand recognition, but some noted gaps in operational efficiency. Then the director moved to the next slide, a press feature on the company's leadership team, and there was Betty's photograph. Her name. Her title. A quote from an industry publication calling her a sharp strategic mind. She looked confident and polished and entirely at ease. The room around me kept moving. I kept my face completely still. 2 days later, my direct manager pulled me aside and asked if I would be willing to take on a deeper analysis of that particular competitor. I said yes without hesitating. The audit took 3 weeks. I worked through it methodically. Revenue patterns, supplier dependencies, client concentration, contract renewal timelines, staffing structures. This was exactly the kind of work my failed business had trained me to do. When you have run something yourself, when you have felt the specific weight of a supplier relationship going wrong or a key client going quiet, you develop a way of reading a company's exposure that people who have only ever worked inside large organizations rarely have. I moved through Betty's company's public filings and industry data with that muscle memory guiding me. What I found was not catastrophic, not yet. But the ground beneath her firm was softer than it appeared from the outside. There were 2 large client contracts representing nearly 40% of their revenue, both due for renewal within 18 months. There was a supplier dependency that looked familiar to me in a way that made my chest tighten. And there was an operational inefficiency in their delivery model that was quietly costing them margin every single quarter. My analysis went to the director with a detailed summary and 3 recommended strategic responses. She read it in one sitting, called me into her office the following morning, and told me it was the most practically useful competitive brief she had received in 2 years. She didn't make a speech about it. She was not a person who made speeches. She simply told me I had done excellent work, authorized a modest bonus, and said she would be trusting me with more sensitive material going forward. I walked back to my desk and sat down and felt something I had not felt in a long time, the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of being good at something in a room that could see it. I was still anonymous. I was still Petra Voss in that building, no history attached. Nobody knew what any of this had cost me to arrive at. 3 days after that conversation, a colleague mentioned in passing that there were whispers of internal restructuring at the competitor firm I had just finished analyzing. The family holiday dinner was at our mother's house, 6 months after the barbecue. I went because my mother had asked me directly and I didn't want to make her feel the weight of what had happened between Bet and me. Bet arrived with expensive wine and louder energy than the room required. She talked about her company, her team, her upcoming travel. She mentioned a new client twice. She laughed at her own stories before finishing them. I watched her hands while she spoke. They weren't still. She reached for her glass more often than she needed to. When the subject of money came up, property prices, someone's renovation cost, something moved quickly across her face before she redirected the conversation. I recognized what I was seeing. I had worn that same expression in the final months before my storefront closed. After dinner, while others were moving to the living room, Bet appeared at my elbow and asked if we could talk privately for a moment. We stood in the hallway outside the kitchen. Bet crossed her arms loosely and said, in the tone of someone resolving a minor misunderstanding, "I hope you know I was just joking at the barbecue. You know how I get when I'm around that side of the family." I looked at her and said nothing for a moment. She took that as encouragement and kept going. She asked how I was doing, what I was working on, whether I had found something stable. I told her I was consulting again, kept it vague, named no specifics. She nodded as though the details didn't particularly interest her, which they didn't. Then she mentioned she had a proposal she needed a second set of eyes on, a pitch document for a new client. She said it casually as though it were a small thing. She did not mention paying me for the time. I told her I had a full plate at the moment. Her expression didn't change much, but something behind her eyes sharpened just slightly before she smiled again. She sent the proposal to my email 3 days later with a short note saying she had gone ahead and attached it since she figured I would have time over the weekend. I read the proposal. It was not strong. The pricing model had a structural flaw that would create a margin problem inside 6 months, and the risk section was thin enough to concern any serious client. I closed the document and did not reply. I thought about what it would mean to help her, the dynamic it would create, the expectation it would establish, the way my expertise would become something she drew on without acknowledgement or cost. I had spent too many years being quietly useful to people who never thought to wonder what it had taken to become that useful. I sent her a brief note saying I wasn't able to take on additional work at the moment, and wished her well with the pitch. She replied with a single word, "Fine." 6 weeks later, a trade publication reported that her firm had announced a significant internal restructuring. The language used was careful. The meaning was not. The news came through properly about 2 weeks after the restructuring announcement. Betty's firm had lost its largest client contract, a 3-year renewal that had been widely expected to close. The client had cited concerns about operational delivery and gone with a competitor. I read the article at my desk on a Tuesday morning and felt something that was not exactly satisfaction, but was close to the particular calm that comes when a thing you understood privately becomes visible publicly. The vulnerability I had flagged in my competitive analysis, the client concentration, the delivery model inefficiency, had done exactly what I had described in my report. My employer had made strategic decisions based on that analysis that now looked very well timed. That same afternoon, the director called me into her office. She told me the department was being restructured upward. She asked whether I would be willing to step into a leadership role. She said the title would change and so would everything that came with it. I said yes. The new role meant I was leading a team of 11 people. I had a seat in leadership meetings. I had budget authority. I had a voice in decisions that shaped the direction of the company. None of this was announced externally. I was still Petra Voss inside that building, my maiden name on every document, my prior history known only to the director who had hired me. I had come to value that separation deeply. The person I was at work had been built entirely from what I had done since the business closed. There was something clean about that. The past couldn't reach into the present and redefine things before I had a chance to. I was not hiding. I simply wasn't explaining myself to anyone who hadn't earned the full story. Then one evening, about a month into the new role, my phone rang with Betty's name on the screen. She had never called me crying before. Not once in our entire lives. I answered. She had been laid off. The restructuring had gone deeper than the public announcement suggested, and her position had been eliminated in the second round of cuts. She had 3 months of mortgage payments in reserve and a reputation that had taken damage from the contract loss, which had happened on her watch, even though the causes ran deeper than any one person. She wasn't angry on the phone. She was quiet in a way I had never heard from her, careful, reduced, stripped of the performance she usually brought to every conversation. She asked if I knew anyone who might be hiring in any capacity at any level. She said she was open to things she wouldn't have considered a year ago. I told her I would ask around. I said it gently and I meant it, though I also knew I needed time to sit with what I actually felt before I made any decisions about what came next. I let several weeks pass. Not to be cruel, I want to be precise about that. I let time pass because I needed to think clearly rather than react. I thought about the barbecue. I thought about the email from my former contact and what it had told me about Betty's silence during those final months before my supplier collapsed. I thought about the proposal she had sent me without asking, and the single-word reply when I declined. I thought about her hands shaking at the dinner table, and what I had recognized in that, and why I had said nothing. I went through all of it without anger, because anger had left me sometime in the first year after the business closed. What I was left with was something more useful, clarity about what I owed her and what I didn't. Then my director came to me one morning and asked if I had anyone I could recommend for an open analyst role on my team. It was entry-level. The work was solid. I thought about it for the rest of the day. The position was real work, meaningful, demanding, and appropriately compensated for the level. It was not a favor disguised as an opportunity. It sat well below where Bet had been professionally for the past decade, and I was fully aware of what that would feel like for her. I thought about whether recommending her was the right thing to do, not for my sake, but actually for hers and for the team. I thought about whether I was doing it out of generosity or out of something more complicated. I sat with that question until I was satisfied I had answered it honestly. What I concluded was this: she was qualified for the role. Her background, despite everything, was genuinely relevant. What she did with the opportunity was not something I could control or should try to. I submitted her resume to the recruitment coordinator with a brief professional note. I did not indicate any personal connection. I listed her qualifications plainly and let them speak without assistance. She received an interview invitation 4 days later. Beth arrived at the building on a Wednesday morning dressed in the careful, slightly too formal way of someone who had not interviewed in a long time and was compensating for the uncertainty. I watched her check in at reception through the glass panel of the conference room where the panel was assembling. She looked composed on the surface, but I could see, in the specific way that you can only see these things in someone you have known your whole life, that she was working hard to hold it together. She was taken through to a smaller room first for a preliminary screen with HR. I heard later that she had asked several clarifying questions about the role's scope and gone quiet when the seniority level was confirmed in plain terms. By the time she was brought through to the main interview panel, some of the initial confidence had settled into something more genuine and considerably more uncertain. She sat down across from the panel. She did not look at me directly. She did not yet know who I was in that room. I had been introduced at the start of the panel session by my title and my maiden name, Petra Voss, Head of Operations Analysis. Betty's eyes had moved across the panel members with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to reading rooms quickly. When they reached me, they paused for less than a second and moved on. She didn't recognize me. We had not seen each other in person since the holiday dinner, and I looked different in a professional context than I did at our mother's table. Different posture, different clothes, different weight in the room. She answered the first 4 questions well. She was honest about her recent experience, including the restructuring, which I respected. She spoke carefully about what she had learned from the contract loss without being defensive about it. The panel was warm but direct. Then, near the end of the session, I looked down at my notes and asked the final question. I asked her, "Can you describe how you respond to the people around you when they are visibly struggling or failing, professionally or otherwise?" The room went quiet in the particular way interview rooms go quiet when a question lands differently than expected. That looked at me for the first time with real focus. Something in the question had caught on something inside her. She started a response, stopped, and started again. She said she believed in honest feedback delivered with care. She said she had not always got that balance right. She paused again. Then she said more quietly that she had sometimes used other people's struggles as a way of measuring her own distance from failure, and that she understood that was not the same thing as helping them. It was the most unguarded thing she had said in the entire session. The room was still. The decision, as the senior panel member in the room, was effectively mine. I offered her the position that afternoon through the formal HR process. No special terms, no additional conditions, no note from me attached to the offer letter. The same salary, the same title, the same expectations that would have applied to any other candidate. She accepted within 2 hours. The acceptance came through the recruitment system as a standard confirmation. That evening I received a text from an unknown number that turned out to be a new phone she had recently got. The message said simply, "Thank you to whoever went to bat for me. I won't waste it." She didn't know who had submitted her resume. She didn't know who had asked the final question. She was thanking a version of the situation that didn't include the full picture. I read the message twice, set my phone face down on the kitchen counter, and made myself dinner. That started on a Monday 3 weeks after accepting the offer. I made a deliberate choice to treat her the way I would treat any new team member. Clear expectations, regular check-ins, honest feedback delivered without personal history attached to it. She worked hard. I had expected that. Beth had always worked hard, whatever her other qualities. She asked good questions. She made one significant error in the 5th week involving a data interpretation that went to a client summary before being caught, and she handled the correction with more grace than I expected. She was quieter in that office than I had ever seen her in any other context. The loudness that defined her in family settings had no place to go in a room where she was the newest and most junior person. I watched something shift in her across those early weeks, a gradual, visible humbling that I had never seen from her before. Then HR sent a calendar notice for a company-wide leadership event with an open invitation to staff and their families. The company event was held on a Friday evening, a combined staff recognition and strategy preview, the kind of gathering that happened once a year and carried a degree of formality. I was introduced formally by the director midway through the evening as part of a leadership acknowledgement segment. She used my full name, Petra Calloway, reinstated from the professional name I had reclaimed 6 months into the role when I had felt settled enough to stop separating things. My name appeared on the large screen behind the director with my title and a brief note about the department's results over the past year. I was standing near the side of the room. I heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the middle of the space. I didn't look immediately. I didn't need to. When I did look, I found Beth standing very still among a cluster of colleagues, her face completely drained of color, staring at the screen and then at me and then at the screen again. The full picture had just assembled itself in front of her all at once. She found me near the end of the evening, after the formal program had finished and people had moved into smaller conversations across the room. She came over slowly, without the directness that usually defined her approach to every room she walked into. She stopped about 2 feet away and said my name, my real name, not a title, with an uncertainty I had genuinely never heard from her before. Then she apologized. She didn't lead with a justification or a reframe. She didn't say she had been joking or that I had always been too sensitive. She said she had laughed at the barbecue because she had been frightened of ending up the same way, of having built something that came apart, of what that would say about her. She said hurting me had felt safer than admitting she was scared. She said she understood if I didn't accept it. I stood with what she had said for a long moment. Then I told her there was something she didn't know about the business she had laughed at. I told her that the storefront had closed, but the work hadn't ended there. The operational model I had built during those years, the supplier risk frameworks, the gap analysis methodology, the client health monitoring systems, had been absorbed into a consultancy structure that I had quietly licensed to 3 firms in the 2 years following the closure. It had generated enough to fund the restart. It had trained me, in the most direct and costly way possible, for every piece of work I had done since. The business that she had called a cute midlife hobby at a barbecue while people around her laughed was the exact foundation of the role I now held, the role that had offered her an interview, reviewed her resume, asked her the question that had stopped her mid-sentence, and extended the offer she had accepted without knowing any of it. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she asked, in a very small voice, whether I was going to let her go now that she knew. I told her no. I told her clearly and without hesitation. I said the decision to recommend her for the role had been made on professional grounds, and the professional grounds hadn't changed because she now knew who had made it. I told her she would succeed or fail at that company entirely on the quality of her work, the same standard that applied to everyone else on the team. I told her I would not protect her from consequences she earned and I would not block opportunities she deserved. That was the arrangement, and it was the same arrangement I had given myself when I walked into that building under a maiden name with no reputation to trade on. No safety net. No history doing the work for me. Just the actual quality of what I brought to the table on any given day. She nodded. She didn't try to say anything that would match the moment, and I was grateful for that. She stayed. Years passed after that evening. Beth remained in the company and built a steady, solid, unspectacular record. The kind of career that doesn't draw attention but doesn't create problems either. She never rose into leadership, and I don't think she expected to. What she did do was become genuinely good at a job that asked her to be careful and precise and accountable, which were things she had to learn rather than things she had always known. We did not become close in the way sisters on television become close after a breakthrough moment. We became something more honest than that. 2 people who understood each other clearly and chose, carefully, to remain in each other's lives without pretending the past hadn't happened. I thought about that barbecue less and less as the years went on. Not because I had forgotten it, but because it had simply become a smaller part of a much larger story. The business didn't fail. It broke me open and then it built me back into something the laughter could never have anticipated. That was the whole truth of it, and it was enough.